Hello, everyone. We're going to begin in a few minutes. We're just going to give everybody 2 or 3 more minutes so they've got a chance to join us. So we'll start in about 2 minutes from now. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this evening's webinar, in which Toni Beardsall will talk about rewilding in an agricultural landscape. For those of you who are new to the Yorkshire Rewilding Network, I just briefly want to introduce a couple of the committee members who are here tonight. I'm John Hartshorn, and facilitating the questions and answers tonight is our network chairperson, Jeff Davitt. As you'll see, we're using Zoom tonight. Everyone is muted and all of your cameras are off. We are hoping to record it and get a recording up on the website, but we'd certainly be very happy for you to submit questions during Toni's talk using the Q&A button that you should see in the Zoom window. Jeff's going to monitor the Q&A session. He's going to grab the questions and hopefully put them to Toni at the end of her talk. But before I hand across to Toni, I just briefly want to introduce the Yorkshire Rewilding Network to you. The network's a registered charity. It came into being on August the 1st of this year as a result of the efforts of a small group of volunteer committee members. The aim of the network is to bring together anyone across Yorkshire who has an interest in rewilding, to inspire one another, share knowledge and experience, and help us work towards a bright and more sustainable future, not just for everyone who lives in the region, but also for the nature that we have in the region and that we hope to have more of across the region as well. So it's clearly still early days, and I'd encourage you to have a good look through the website, where you'll find stories to inspire you, copies of our newsletters to date, snippets of news, and we've also put together some pages of resources that we think people might find useful, such as book reviews, web links, and an events page that we will add to as we build our program of events for 2021. We're working on that at the moment, and we will publicize that over the website, Twitter, and the newsletter on an ongoing basis. So do remember also to go to the Join Us page and register so that you can receive our newsletters. And there's also a contact page so that if you have any suggestions for content, events, or if you have a topic that you particularly like to present, then do please get in touch with us. And if you're a Twitter user, you can follow the network. We're already up to almost 500 followers since we started in August. And of course, if you enjoy this evening's presentation, we'd be extremely appreciative of any donations you might be able to make to help us with our running costs. And we can do that through the donate page on the website. So that brings us to the main event of the evening. And by way of introduction, Toni Beardsall studied her MSc in Applied Wildlife Conservation at Anglia Ruskin University. She's particularly interested in exploring the ways in which rewilding can contribute to the well-being of individuals and communities, whilst at the same time reversing declines in biodiversity. As farmers have the potential to be significant players in rewilding efforts, Toni's master's thesis was part of a collaborative project between Anglia Ruskin, Cambridge and Sussex Universities, and focused on how English farmers and landowners view the social impacts of rewilding. So if you're happy, Toni, I think it's over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your introduction. Okay, so yes, as John mentioned, I'll be talking about the research I conducted for my MSc dissertation this past summer. And we were looking at the socio-ecological impacts of rewilding as perceived by farmers and landowners in England. And this is part of a larger ongoing study led by Anglia Ruskin University looking at the same topic. So for me, the idea of this study was really exciting. I come from a family of very traditional farmers on my mum's side, but it was my fascination with rewilding as a restoration approach that led me last year away from a career as a music therapist and into taking the year out to do a conservation master's. I was really curious to explore a farmer's perspective of the social impacts of rewilding and how much this perspective varies within the farming community. And before I begin, it's important to highlight that there is overlap between the preliminary findings of my dissertation and the broader project, which is yet to be published. So perhaps this webinar will be an explorative appetizer in preparation for a part 2, when the findings of the broader study are published, hopefully at some point next year. In the meantime, I hope that you'll leave this webinar with a greater insight into the well-being impacts of rewilding as perceived by the farmers we interviewed, the factors that affect their support for rewilding projects, and considerations and mitigation opportunities for future rewilding interventions. So this is an overview of the webinar this evening. I'll begin with a brief introduction to rewilding as defined for our study, and then I'll introduce the objectives and background to our research. I'll then outline the research process and my findings, concluding with some considerations for the rewilding movement based on the perspectives of the farmers and landowners we interviewed. And finally, for me, a primary role of the broader project is to facilitate dialogue. So I'm really looking forward to an open discussion at the end. Please don't hold back. And I hope there are a few farmers online here as well to hear their views. So for our study, we defined rewilding as an ecosystem restoration approach that gives room to self-sustaining natural processes with limited or decreasing human intervention. And what does rewilding actually look like on the ground? Well, there are different congress forms of rewilding. So there's trophic rewilding, as it's called in the scientific literature. And that involves the reintroduction of missing components of ecosystems, particularly missing components of the food web, such as the large herbivores and the large carnivores. And functional replacements or proxies are used in place of large extinct megafauna missing from our landscape, such as the longhorns that you can see at the bottom there. You probably know that large herbivores provide natural disturbance to the soil, which stimulates plant germination as well as promoting biodiversity through their natural grazing. Essentially, these animals aid natural processes such as nutrient cycling and decomposition. And there's also abiotic or ecological rewilding, which can encompass the restoration of natural waterways and flood regimes, or the removal of dispersal barriers which impede the movement of wildlife, particularly species higher up the food chain. So their removal improves connectivity between habitats, which should increase dispersal at all trophic levels, and therefore should increase the trophic complexity of an ecosystem. And that's really important, because with greater complexity, it is thought that there will be greater resilience, and resilience will be crucial to weathering the climate crisis. And of course, all of these approaches can occur on very different scales. Whilst these are approaches to the recovery and sustaining of natural processes, ecosystems, and biodiversity, rewilding is crucially also about people. As individuals, households, communities, and societies, both in terms of the opportunities from creating a nature-based economy, but also the impacts of the trade-offs. And a key, particularly heterogeneous group of people managing land in the UK is, of course, the farming community. So I'm going to dive straight in with the main objectives for this research. I wanted to assess the links between rewilding, the perceived impact on farmers, and levels of support through the lens of a wellbeing perspective. So firstly, I wanted to identify the perceived wellbeing impacts. And secondly, I wanted to understand the factors influencing their support for rewilding projects and any mitigation opportunities. And why is this important? Well, 70% of England is agricultural land, so farmers stand to be significantly affected by any ambitious restoration efforts. Farmers are also under mounting pressure to compensate for the environmental degradation that's been caused by the post-war emphasis on production. So they're increasingly needing to take active measures that enhance biodiversity. And the potential impacts on farmers and their well-being as a result of rewilding have, as of yet, received little research attention. So it's a really crucial time to ensure that we address this gap in research, and I'm going to highlight 4 of the primary reasons for this. So firstly, we have the UK's departure from the EU and the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and the forthcoming ELM policy, which stands for Environmental Land Management. So this is an unprecedented opportunity to redefine the country's rural and environmental policies that shape land use, rural practices, and people's engagement with the land. The removal of direct support, so the single farm payment scheme, will be key to this change. The second reason is that rewilding is rapidly gaining traction as an approach for ecosystem restoration and reversing biodiversity losses. And we've seen a boom in rewilding projects in 2020 alone. And similarly, there's been real acceleration in the publication of rewilding science. However, whilst most current rewilding projects are funded privately, any major upscaling of rewilding will require support from the national and local government. And so documenting the social, economic, and ecological benefits and the mitigation opportunities for the key stakeholders will be critical in gaining this support. The third factor is that within rewilding initiatives, there is of course potential for profound changes in the landscape and in the forms of human engagement with the environment. And this is particularly the case in England, given its size and population density, and also how managed our landscapes are. So there is a real need to understand the socio-ecological costs and benefits. And the fourth factor is that, as you're probably aware, historically and still today, there is a fair amount of contention surrounding both the term and the practice of rewilding, particularly where farmers have experienced negative impacts of high-profile projects. And additionally, some of the media have contributed to polarizing narratives, often related to carnivores as a threat to livestock. So with these factors in mind, a thorough understanding of the socio-ecological costs and benefits will ensure that rewilding interventions have a greater likelihood of success and support if key stakeholders such as the farming community feel that their needs and concerns are heard and taken seriously. It will inform decision-making regarding the suitability of a rewilding intervention for a particular locality. and it will help to mitigate negative impacts on local people. So the research process involved conducting semi-structured interviews on Zoom or via phone. We had hoped to interview in person, but due to COVID, this wasn't possible. There were 4 interviewers, 1 postdoc and 3 students, and we recruited participants via Twitter, through farming groups and networks, and then through snowball sampling, where existing participants would suggest others who may be interested in taking part. For the interview questions, in order to capture the perceptions of wellbeing impacts related to specific rewilding approaches, we presented them with 3 hypothetical scenarios, which I'll share with you in a moment. And we also had questions relating to factors that might affect their support, their own perceptions of the farmer's role in the UK, their desired vision for the local landscape, and their attitudes to wildlife and nature management in the UK. So here are the hypothetical scenarios, and bear in mind that the questions related to the scenarios always asked their view, supposing it were to be implemented in the local area rather than on their own land. So the first was a beaver release, where a group of local charities and land management organisations obtains a licence and releases several pairs of beavers into the waterways. The animals are free living, and as the population grows, they're expected to spread further across the watershed. So the second scenario is restoration of natural processes on a private farm, where a private landowner, with the support of researchers and conservation NGOs, decides to stop conventional agriculture on their farm with marginal land and lets natural vegetation and wildlife recover in a hands-off approach. The landowner also introduces free-roaming animals like longhorn cattle, heritage pig breeds, and wild ponies to imitate extensive natural grazing by
Hi everybody, I think we've just lost Toni for a moment there, hopefully not for too long. We'll see if we can get her back. If she's only able to rejoin by sound, I do have her slides, so please just bear with us for a moment and we'll see if we can get her back on.
Just go over the second scenario again. So the second scenario is restoration of natural processes on a private farm, where a private landowner, with the support of researchers and conservation NGOs, decides to stop conventional agriculture on their farm with marginal land and lets natural vegetation and wildlife recover in a hands-off approach. The landowner also introduces free-roaming animals like longhorn cattle, heritage pig breeds, and wild ponies to imitate extensive natural grazing by wild herbivores. And the landowner harvests the meat for these animals for sale and diversifies the farm income by hosting tourists. And finally, the third scenario is a landscape scale ecological restoration, where a partnership of local landowners, including individuals, charities, government bodies, and private companies, join together to implement a landscape scale approach to the management of a large area of land. Activities might include reducing the management of land, allowing a more natural flow of water, allowing the return of more natural vegetation on some parts of the land, and reintroducing animals like semi-wild cattle and ponies, or previously lost species like pine martens and beavers. Now, you may have noticed that we didn't mention rewilding at all in those scenarios, and that was also the case in all of our communication with participants, unless they initiated its use. And this was because we wanted to focus on the substance of the practice rather than evoked responses associated with the term rewilding, given its contentious nature. So instead, we used the phrase ecological restoration of natural processes, And when inquiring about their experience of rewilding interventions, we refer to environmental projects that try to restore natural processes, for example, through restoring natural water flow or reintroducing large herbivores. So in terms of the study sample, we conducted 36 interviews with active farmers, land managers, and representatives from farming groups from a diverse geographical locations throughout England. The participants represented a range of agricultural systems with varying prioritisation of values, be that more production orientated, more biodiversity orientated, or more profit orientated. And some self-identified as a conventional or traditional agricultural system. Some practiced wildlife-friendly agriculture and conservation agriculture, and some were organic, and others identified as a regenerative agricultural system. And just to explain for those less familiar with regenerative agriculture, it's a system that has grown out of America fairly recently, which prioritises soil health and land regeneration. And it does this by limiting disturbance, mechanical, physical, or chemical, through striving for diversity of both plant and animal species, through maintaining a living root in the soil as long as possible throughout the year, by keeping the soil covered at all times, and through integrating livestock into the system. We also had a range of experience and knowledge of rewilding, with some knowing very little, some informed primarily by the media, and others having direct experience of a rewilding project. There is potential bias in the sample, for example, overrepresentation of people from high education backgrounds or farmers using Twitter. And lastly, in regards to the study sample, it's important to acknowledge that I can only speak for the spectrum of perspectives that we encountered. So whilst we sought a broad spectrum of farmers for the participant pool, 36 farmers participants are a tiny fraction of those engaged in agriculture, and their views cannot necessarily be representative of the views of all farmers in England. The final stage of the research process was the thematic analysis, where I coded the interview transcripts in two main stages, initially for emerging themes, and then a second phase specifically coding for impacts using a standard wellbeing framework I had adapted. The particular framework used is the Domains of Human Wellbeing for Social Impact Assessments in Conservation and Environmental Management by Kaplan, Hallam and Bennett. So as you can see, the primary domains I assessed were cultural, social, governance, health, and economic well-being. And it was the components of each domain that I adapted for suitability. So before I discuss the main findings, there are two general observations I'd like you to hold in mind. All participants cared for the environment. The differences were more linked to how they go about caring for it, depending on differing priorities driven by values, mindset, and also contrasting baselines of biodiversity and preferences for how a landscape should look. And these priorities do seem to play an important function in shaping support for rewilding projects. And a second observation is that all participants who were active farmers mentioned that other people in the local area can do with their land as they wish, including rewilding. So it may not be what they would do themselves with their land, and they would happily give their advice or opinion if asked. But there's a very deeply rooted culture that it's not their place to tell someone directly how to manage their own land. And this was a prevalent response, given that we were asking for their opinion based on somebody else implementing one of the scenarios in the local area or on neighbouring land. So the three primary concerns of social impacts identified were national food security as a result of reduced agricultural production, the impact on profitability, farming as a viable business, and the impact on their occupation. And I'll explore these in slightly more detail. Participants voiced concerns of food security and rising food costs resulting from more land being taken out of production. Some participants also raised concerns about the higher price of healthier pasture-fed produce sold by rewilded estates as an example of inequitable distribution of rewilding impacts. And that's because they perceive the majority of the immediate, more tangible social benefits. So, for example, recreational opportunities in a landscape which affords increased connection with nature and therefore a range of positive impacts for mental and emotional health. They believe these would accrue primarily to the middle class, who have access to transport and can afford more expensive organic produce. On a global level, some participants were concerned that rewilding productive land in the UK would mean exporting environmental degradation, particularly to South American countries such as Argentina and Brazil, where you have the burning of the Amazon for land used by ranchers to produce beef. So, as well as questioning the morality and ethics of making this somebody else's problem, there were also concerns that rewilding undermined the high production standards and productivity of British farmers. And one participant said, "You know, we banned neonicotinoids seed dressings because of the potential impact on bees. And that's great, but now we're bringing in rapeseed from Ukraine where they use it. I don't think our bees are worth more than their bees. I don't think our landscape's worth more than their landscape. And particularly when we look at productivity, an acre of our landscape isn't worth 5 or 10 acres of somebody else's landscape." The next primary social impact identified was profitability. Many participants suggested that ecotourism on rewilded farms could boost local economies by increasing footfall and thereby indirectly generating revenue for local businesses and providing a small number of jobs. On the other hand, some suggested that tourism income from rewilded farms would suffer from the law of diminishing returns as the novelty effect gets diluted. More tangibly, reduced demand for agricultural services would have a negative impact on livelihoods and local businesses across the rural economy. There were also concerns that whilst increased public footfall would be beneficial for the emotional well-being of the community through their increased connection with nature, it could be a threat to the emotional and economic well-being of the farmers due to concerns of rural crime, littering, and fly tipping. And these views were prevalent throughout the sample and often communicated very passionately. And given that the interviews took place during the first lockdown, such views appeared to be driven by farmers' direct experiences of the influx of the public into the countryside. And finally, occupation. There were 3 components of a farmer's occupation in particular that rewilding was perceived to impact most. And the first was their role. So most participants saw rewilding to be a direct impediment to the diverse components of their job, affecting their daily activities, their purpose in life, and their lifestyle as a farmer. Take, for example, many of the participants practicing regenerative or conservation agriculture. For them, the diversity and challenge of profitably achieving food production alongside environmental benefits was a really exciting prospect, fueling a vocational passion and just sheer enthusiasm. And this is likely due to positive feedback of their achievements in the form of tangible evidence of improved soils and pastures, increased biodiversity, and also new social learning networks, which were allowing these participants to align their personal and business goals with their values and identity as stewards of their land. And I quote from one participant, "I take as much pleasure from the wildlife around me as producing crops. But for me, the two go hand in hand and they're both equally important. And I really see a future where we can integrate them both. I think it's probably the most exciting time to be in farming." Participants also spoke of the positive outcomes for their emotional and mental well-being through the meaning, purpose, and fulfillment of working in nature and their enjoyment of increased abundance of certain species, or their pleasure in aesthetic changes such as the beauty of a wildflower meadow growing as a direct result of their efforts to enhance biodiversity. And some of the participants see rewilding as being in harmony with these agricultural systems, particularly if introduced in the local area and beneficial for the connectivity of thriving bird and insect populations. Yet, if rewilding were to happen on their own land, they felt these wellbeing gains would be lost, and the reasons behind this were deeply rooted in their sense of their own identity, their connection to the land and community, and their sense of place. And that brings us to the second component of occupation perceived to be impacted by rewilding, social identity. So for some participants, there's a discrepancy between the idea of rewilding and their reputation within the community as being seen as a good farmer. The concept of a good farmer has historically been aligned with production and traditionally been evidenced by tidiness, so that well-managed fields, neat hedgerows, and healthy crops are measures of your status within the community. And this view was also very deeply rooted. Some participants needed to keep the farm tidy and free of weeds to satisfy their own well-being, with one participant finding stewardship schemes really upsetting because of his messy margins. Other participants envisaged knock-on effects to their emotional well-being and that of their families due to existing pressure to conform to a level of tidiness, with one saying, "It's that community pressure that I'm doing things a little bit different than some. Am I a bad farmer because my place looks more untidy than my next door neighbour, who's a very conventional farmer and so all neat straight lines?" Interestingly, the good farmer status was also referred to as someone who saw the pursuit of productivity and environmental benefits as going hand in hand. So this is perhaps indicative of a potential shift in attitudes within some strands of the farming community. This change may accelerate and pave the way towards transformational adaptations as farmers increasingly experience more erratic weather patterns and pressure from society and government. Finally, the third component of wellbeing impacts on occupation is related to control. So the idea of control arose in numerous guises, largely with regard to land management, but also in relation to choice or agency, which are thought necessary to achieve well-being. Control was referenced particularly in response to the beaver scenario and in regards to reintroductions more generally, essentially where an animal is managing the land instead of you. Most participants initiated the idea of predator reintroduction themselves, and compensation schemes were deemed insufficient reparation for the negative emotional stress caused by livestock predation, and for their time and energy invested in the animals and painstakingly building the genetic integrity of their herd or their flock. In terms of losing control over the land, compensation schemes for restoration of natural waterways were looked upon slightly more favourably, though again participants questioned how other farmers would feel about losing land value and productivity. And then when talking about agency, a number of participants made the distinction between those inside and outside of the community, linking again to a farmer's social and cultural identity as holders of traditional and local knowledge. Many participants were excited to join with other farmers to increase connectivity and habitat for biodiversity. Yet smaller family farms, including farmers formerly trained as ecologists, raised concerns over lacking autonomy in top-down landscape scale projects, especially those imposed or dictated by outsiders in partnership with conservation NGOs and wildlife trusts. This isn't always the case. One participant was actively reaching out to his local wildlife trust. But where there is still underlying distrust, there's a strong feeling that ecological restoration must be driven by local communities in bottom-up community strategies as the only way of obtaining buy-in. So that brings us to the end of the primary social impacts of rewilding that were identified. The second part of the results I wanted to highlight were the factors influencing support, or modifiers as I'll refer to them. And these were numerous, so I'll highlight just a small selection. So firstly, the option to control or reverse changes. This factor was particularly prominent in response to the beaver release scenario, and again, reintroductions more generally, should they become detrimental to livestock, asset welfare, or the economic integrity of their businesses. And this feeds into current debate regarding beaver populations in Tayside, which you may have heard about this summer, where recent licensed killings have triggered questioning of the moral and ethical integrity of decisions to reintroduce the species. And farmers face a similar situation with badgers, which, as you'll know, also have protected status and can cause quite significant anxiety for some farmers. One participant said, "When we start to talk about these reintroductions, I do think that we need to be able to have a dialogue about what happens if things get out of balance and what can be done if a species gets so abundant that it starts to create problems. That is one of the fears that people have with these releases, is that once something happens like this, the species gets protected status and that's it forever. Nothing you can do to stop anything again." And I think that that is really holding back dialogue or a discussion. A second modifier is the need to achieve a balance. And this came up in relation to the need for a balance of habitat heterogeneity at multiple spatial scales, a balance of landscape aesthetics, and a balanced diversity of food production, so effectively increased diversity of crops rather than large expanses of monocultures. So for example, reflections on the ecological benefits of a private rewilded farm estate consistently highlighted that over-replication of this specific scrub habitat throughout England would be undesirable, just shifting from one dominant habitat to another. Many participants considered it possible to deliver the ecological benefits of rewilding through sustainable farming systems, such as regenerative agriculture. For these participants, their perceptions of the social impacts of rewilding tended to be neutral or negative, given that they simply couldn't justify the costs and risks to food security and environmental exploitation by taking productive land out of production. And one participant suggested that with regenerative agriculture and with mimicking natural grazing systems, we can get all, and I mean all of the ecological benefits that you can get from that sort of rewilding. And at the same time, you can produce food and have businesses working in the countryside. And finally, more self-explanatory modifiers included the right place at the right time and for the right reasons, whether or not there is public access to a rewilded site, and the governance of a project, which I have already discussed in relation to buy-in and top-down versus bottom-up interventions. So finally, I'll touch on some considerations. My dissertation gave more weight to patterns of commonly raised concerns, such as food security, profitability, and occupation, rather than perceived benefits. And this was in the hope that they'll be addressed as priorities in decision-making processes for rewilding projects that involve farmers and other landowners as key stakeholders. It's clear rewilding affects well-being across multiple dimensions. Therefore, I'd like to raise the following considerations for rewilding proponents. So good governance is crucial for support. Scaling up rewilding projects that involve agricultural land will require bottom-up initiatives that are led by farmers. And this may seem an unlikely scenario given some of the participants' concerns that I've highlighted. But I think it's more a case of starting with where there are common values. And I would suggest that rewilding and regenerative agriculture are complementary approaches. And then listening and ensuring farmers feel heard. Only once that connection has been established can a shared understanding develop and then lead to farmer-led change, supported and facilitated if necessary by conservationists and the rewilding movement. Secondly, I think there needs to be sufficient incentives, financial or otherwise, and compensation where necessary, to encourage direct participation and engagement with the farming community. So this could also include experiential social learning, such as talks or interdisciplinary workshops focused on successful and inclusive examples of rewilded agricultural land, perceived by the farmers themselves to be replicable. And it would be useful to have a menu of restoration options for landowners and communities to choose from to suit their values and needs. Landowners need to be supported in ecological restoration efforts. As I mentioned, when it comes to agricultural land, the role of conservationists or the rewilding movement is to support farmers and landowners and facilitate if necessary, rather than acting as a spokesperson. And though this kind of approach takes time, you have also at the other end of the spectrum, a small group of farmers employing a more extreme, fast-paced approach to rewilding and introductions that can be seen to prioritise urgency over communal discussion. So if policy ensures that ELM can favour agricultural businesses that protect and restore biodiversity, and regenerative agriculture can continue to gain momentum, then perhaps a balance can be found. In regards to further study, my dissertation offers an overview of perceived social impacts in relation to well-being, but the social ecological well-being framework is a complex and inherently relational construct. Therefore, a more robust analysis might include a way of measuring the extent to which each objective impact contributes or detracts from human well-being. And also, it would be beneficial to have an examination of perceptions throughout the UK for a comparative understanding of regional and national specificities. So before I finish, if you're interested in looking into this topic area further, as a start, I'd highly recommend James Rebanks's very accessible book, English Pastoral, if you've not already come across it. He's a farmer up in Cumbria and provides some really useful historical context to the social norms and culture embedded within the farming community that I touched on briefly. And of course, please do feel free to get in touch with me. My email is at the bottom of the slide there if you would like any more information or if you had any questions. And I can put you in touch with other members of the research team as well. I'd like to thank the research team for their efforts and support on this collaborative and multidisciplinary project. And I'd also really like to thank the participants who gave their time and in many instances really wore their hearts on their sleeves, particularly as they talked about their well-being during the interviews. Thank you to the Yorkshire Rewilding Network for having me. And finally, thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Toni. That was a really illuminating view of the social impacts of rewilding in an agricultural landscape. I was particularly taken with the line that farmers see it not their place to tell others what to do, as quite deeply held, and therefore you can see why perhaps they don't like being told by others what they should be doing. So a really, as I say, illuminating presentation that around the social dimensions of the discussion about rewilding in agriculture. We've got lots of questions, so I'll start off with those if I may. Did you find farmers particularly protective of cultural heritage as well as environmental, so barns, stone walls, that side, or was that outside the scope of your research?
I don't think it was necessarily outside the scope of our research, but it didn't really come up as a theme in terms of physical structures like barns or stone walls. But I would say that the cultural identity that was held within the landscape, so the idea of the landscape changing due to rewilding, was a really prevalent theme. And if you think about it, farmers have been shaping and cultivating the landscape for generations. So it's understandable that they would hold a certain identity within how the landscape is as it stands now.
Okay, thank you. And did your research provide any insight into some of the more successful ways to communicate with the farming community about prospective rewilding projects in their area? So how you best communicate with farming groups and farmers?
To be honest, I would point to the last points that I was making, in the sense that I think, you know, the first thing to do is to listen. And as I was saying, without that connection, without feeling heard, there isn't going to be an opportunity for a shared understanding, which is really necessary to move forwards. So for me, that would be the priority. And it was quite illuminating doing the interviews, really, because I'm not sure how often farmers are asked their opinions about this kind of thing, and they were really kind of honest and open interviews, and it was quite a privilege really to hear their views in that way. So I think there's far more space for dialogue.
I definitely agree with that. Thank you. There were a few questions sent in before this evening's presentation, but you answered all of those during your talk. So move past those. I didn't want the person who'd sent them in to feel they hadn't been covered. They were about misconceptions in the farming community about rewilding, difference between top-down and bottom-up approaches, and how you actually measure the sociological impact. What about the position of tenant farmers? Were there any discussions you had with tenants who expressed concern about their landlords going down a rewilding route, which might either remove or certainly affect the way they manage the land?
No. All of the tenant farmers that we spoke to, or certainly those that I interviewed, were already practicing either organic or regenerative agriculture. And in many cases, this was something that they wanted to push themselves. So they were proponents. But I don't think in terms of rewilding, we ever had it that way around, where a landowner was pushing it and a tenant farmer was having to kind of adjust. There were issues where certain participants were struggling with landlords to do with money that they were receiving for the stewardship schemes, and that the tenant farmers had very little agency in terms of how that money was spent. But that was a separate issue. So yeah, no, not in terms of tenant farmers having to jump onto the rewilding wagon.
Okay, thank you. I like this one. There are calls for support to facilitate projects, and that being important. But even some landscape scale projects led by wildlife trusts can be seen as too top down. So which groups or organisations would be seen as best placed to offer support?
To be honest, I think wildlife trusts and conservation NGOs can be seen as good options for offering support, and rewilding networks now that they're springing up. So any farmers in Yorkshire, the rewilding network is the place to go. As long as there is that that kind of open approach, and again, I can't stress it enough, the listening at the beginning, and the acceptance that really the farmers are the experts of their own land. And if you start from there, I think you should be much more successful.
Thank you. I'll try you with this one, but don't be afraid if you wish to bat it back my way. Is there a perceived minimum size and area of a rewilding project?
I can't really answer in regards to the study because it wasn't really within the scope of the study. My personal view is that if we can encourage everybody to be rewilding their own gardens, kind of pollinator flowers for outside their windows if they don't have a garden. So I would say every little helps, but I will bat that back to you in terms of, landscape scale rewilding and really improving connectivity.
Thank you. Yeah, for some of the landscape scale effects, clearly there's got to be a degree of size to allow some of the more complex processes to develop. But certainly in terms of people's awareness, their mental health, just being part of that spectrum, then I would absolutely agree with you. Every little helps, and it's all contributing to a recovery of nature. Thank you for that. I didn't need to offer you to bat it back. You covered it anyway. Here's one. Do you, sorry, I should say the first bit as well. Great talk tonight, Toni. Really insightful, it starts with. Do you see national park landscape statements about protective landscapes, which are often heavily grazed uplands, a blocker for rewilding? And could the authorities play a key role in connecting landowners to engage in rewilding practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think authorities could play a larger part. I think we're probably looking at that kind of connecting coming from below. So things like the Rewilding network, and I think rewilders as well getting together with interested parties. So we could push for the authorities to deliver that kind of connection, but I think that's going to be a slower process.
Okay. Getting towards the end now, there are one or two further ones that aren't really to do with the social side and the impact's a bit more technical, so I'll skip those with apologies to the people that have asked. But one that I think is relevant, you said that you didn't mention the term rewilding unless the participants mentioned it themselves. Sort of how often did that happen? Did most farmers immediately make the link between natural processes and rewilding, or was that the exception?
It was kind of half and half, really. There were some farmers that had very limited knowledge of rewilding, and so even offering the hypothetical scenarios was quite abstract for them. And in many instances, they found that they didn't have an opinion because they weren't aware of any kind of concrete examples that they could draw conclusions from. And then there were other farmers who knew exactly what we were referring to through the hypothetical scenarios as well, and would name those examples. So about half and half, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. And I'll probably make this the final one. Is there evidence to suggest that rewilding could lead to significant destruction of ecosystems internationally?
If I'm honest, I'm not aware of that kind of evidence, but it's probably important to note that within this study, I was looking at rewilding literature that was kind of promoting the ecosystem benefits. So I don't know if I've answered that kind of satisfactorily, but I'm not aware of evidence that it could be hugely destructive.
Certainly me neither. It doesn't mean that it never is, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be the general view, if I put it that way. Just before I conclude, I'm just going to say there are a few questions from Chris O, Jeff H, that aren't really the nature of this. Chris O, I have replied to your query into the network the other day, so let's hook up separately about that one. There's an interesting line about common land, but I think we're pretty much out of time on that, so apologies for that. But really giving us food for thought in the presentation as a whole. So just serves for me to thank you. You've had about 90 viewers on throughout the evening, so hopefully everybody's enjoyed that. I'll just make one more reminder that we do run just on donations if you've enjoyed it. We don't have big running costs, but just a bit of insurance and some Zoom license gets us by. But we're looking to grow the network, so the more we can do to connect people, inspire people, keep our inclusive approach, and just encourage dialogue, I think is what we're about as a network. So our next talk will be in January. We're just finalising the date for that and the subject title. So keep an eye on the website and do sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Twitter, and you'll hear all about it. But thanks for the great questions. Thanks for tuning in this evening, and thanks especially to Toni and to John for the introduction earlier. See you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Toni.